Good afternoon, and welcome to Open for Questions at whitehouse.gov. My name is Cami Croft. I'm the Deputy New Media Director here at the White House. And today, we're going to be taking your questions live from Facebook and whitehouse.gov on the topic of the President's Innovations Budget. And today, I have with us some of our top experts on the subject. They are Deanna Farrell from the National Economic Council, Aneesh Chopra, who is our CTO, Tom Kalil from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and last but not least, our CIO Vivek Kundra. Now, before we get started with some of our questions, why don't you each take a moment to kind of describe the President's Innovations Budget and kind of set the stage for today's discussion.
Would you like me to start?
Of course.
Why don't I take it on? And I think what I would do just to start the conversation is to remind ourselves that over the course of last year, which has been a very, very difficult year for a lot of Americans, it's really easy to lose sight of the spirit of innovation and the strength of this American economy. And yet this administration has not for a minute lost that vision or that sight. From the very beginning, as we took office with the Recovery Act, $100 billion of that Recovery Act was targeted toward precisely enabling that spirit of innovation within the American economy. And the budget, which was announced this week, builds on that set of choices in really bringing back to an articulation of what we see as this administration's innovation strategy. You're going to hear from many of my colleagues here today, but I just want to sort of set the frame for it. We see the tired debate about the role of government in enabling innovation as really tired. This is not about articulating either a laissez-faire, the markets will do everything, versus the government's the only answer to every solution. This is really about government targeting the right sets of enablers to allow the market to innovate and to diffuse innovations and scale those innovations. And so we have a pretty coherent program that starts with investing in the building blocks of American innovation. This is R&D, education, infrastructure, IT ecosystems, and Tom will talk a little bit about the R&D piece of this. But of course, those building blocks are just the starting point. We need to ensure that we promote competitive markets that spur productive innovation. This is promoting U.S. exports, improving the public sector innovation itself, which you'll hear from Vivek. And then finally, these have to be channeled towards catalyzing breakthroughs for national priorities, whether it's green technologies and clean energy, advanced vehicle technologies, healthcare IT. We'll hear from Aneesh on that. So look forward to sharing some of our thoughts on this and most importantly, taking your questions. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to jump in?
Sure. As Deanna mentioned, one of the elements of the President's innovation strategy is investing in the building blocks of innovation. And the key one of those is research and development, which is an area that the office that I work for, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, is particularly focused on. And the President believes it's imperative to invest in research and development for 4 key reasons. First of all, R&D can create the industries and jobs of the future. So in the same way that past investments have led to the internet, search engine technology, GPS, the whole biotech industry, we need to be continuing to invest so that we create the foundation for the industries and jobs of the future. Second, if you think about every single national challenge that we face, whether it's accelerating the transition to a low-carbon economy, or allowing Americans to live longer, healthier lives, or dealing with new threats to our national and homeland security, research and development can play a critical role in addressing those challenges. Third, when we make investments in research and development, particularly at our nation's leading universities, we also help prepare the next generation of scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, the people who are going to develop the next Googles and Genentechs and GEs. And finally, the expansion of the frontiers of human knowledge is really an end in itself. One of the things that makes us different from the other species that are on this planet is that we're innately curious. We're interested in discovering how human consciousness emerges from 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses. We still only really understand 5% of the matter of the universe. So we don't understand why the universe is continuing to expand at an accelerating rate. So a lot of these fundamental questions we have about ourselves and the world around us motivates this increased funding for research and development. And that's exactly what the president's budget does in the budget that he released earlier this week. His budget would keep 3 key science agencies, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy's Office of Science, and NIST, which Aneesh is going to talk about, on a trajectory to double. His budget would add $1 billion at the National Institutes of Health for investments in biomedical research. His budget would increase support for science, technology, engineering, and math education at the K through 12 level by 40%. And it was also provide $300 million in a new agency in the Department of Energy, ARPA-E, which in the same way that DARPA gave us the internet and GPS and stealth technology, they're going to be responsible for supporting the revolution and transformation that we need to occur in the area of clean energy technology. So it's an exciting budget. It's clear that the president is really committed to making these long-term investments in research and development that are going to be necessary to ensure that the United States can compete and win in the global economy. One other point that I'd like to close with, and that is that the president's innovation strategy includes a set of grand challenges. In the same way that President Kennedy talked about the importance of putting a man on the moon, the president's strategy identifies a number of areas where science and technology can help us achieve important goals, whether it's developing solar cells as cheap as paint, or developing software for education that would be as effective as a personal tutor and compelling as the best video game, or developing smart anti-cancer therapeutics that deliver drugs only to tumor cells and greatly reduce the side effects associated with chemotherapy. We've posted those grand challenges in a request for information on our blog. You can go to blog.ostp.gov, and we're inviting comments about the grand challenges that the president has identified, other ones that we should be considering, and how we can create an architecture of participation so that companies, research universities, and volunteers can get involved in helping to address these grand challenges. So it's an exciting vision, and I look forward to getting your questions.
Vivek?
Well, what's really exciting about the president's budget also is the investments that the administration is actually making in the federal government in terms of making sure that the services that are provided are done so in a manner that create value for the American people. If you think about the IT investments that have been made, and if you think about the history of federal IT, it's riddled with failures, large-scale failures of massive IT projects. What we're doing in the 2011 budget is we're investing $79 billion to make sure that we can harness the innovations that Tom and Diana talked about to apply them to the public sector. Consider this for a second. The US Patent and Trademark Office takes 3 years to issue a patent. And one of the reasons it takes so long is because the patent application is actually submitted online electronically, then it's printed and entered into another system manually. The Veterans Administration has a backlog when it comes to processing VA claims. And a big part of that is because the way those systems are processed in terms of the applications, it's done so by passing the information from one manila envelope to the other, from one processor to the next, and mailed rather than done so in an electronic way. The budget actually invests in making sure that we're modernizing the United States government, and we're also making sure that we're tapping into the ingenuity of the American people to do so. There are 4 core priorities we're focusing on. One is making sure that we're effectively managing the federal IT budget, and part of what we're doing here is making sure it's done so in a very transparent way. As you know, the administration launched the federal IT dashboard, which was shining light into how the US government was spending money on federal IT projects. Within a matter of weeks of launching that platform, the Veterans Administration actually halted 45 IT projects, out of which it terminated 12. What the budget does, it actually also lists a number of IT initiatives and other innovative solutions that we're using to make sure that we're not wasting taxpayer dollars and that we're investing in solutions that are going to be game-changing and deliver the best services to the American people. Second area we're investing in is efficiency and effectiveness, making sure that the way we spend money when it comes to infrastructure alone, we spend about $19 billion in IT infrastructure. Yet in the last 10 years, we've gone from 432 data centers in the federal government to over 1,200. It makes no sense when you think about these investments. So what we're doing is we're focusing on cloud computing to make sure that we're the beneficiaries of some of the game-changing technologies that you've seen in your personal lives, in terms of thinking about how you can go online and actually make a reservation, as the president talks about OpenTable. Yet, when you deal with the Social Security Administration, you've got to do it over the phone or send in a letter. Why aren't we able to harness the same type of innovation and the Darwinian pressure when it comes to innovation within the public sector? The third area we're focused on is cybersecurity. The president's budget introduces $3.6 billion in a comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative on top of the IT investments and security investments across federal departments. As we know, the underpinning of the modern economy is the digital infrastructure that we all rely on. And lastly, we're very focused on making sure we continue our advances in a transparent and open government. This Friday, Aneesh and I are actually going to be introducing a dashboard that will hold agencies accountable for how transparent and open they are. And of course, you've seen the Open Government Directive that leans forward in making sure that the default setting of Washington is changed from that of being closed, opaque, to one that is transparent, open, and participatory. But part of what we want to be able to do is make sure that every dollar that's spent in the public sector is done so in a responsible way. At the same time, we want to make sure that we're leveraging modern technologies to change the way the American people interact with their government.
And Aneesh?
Yes, Cami, thank you. The third pillar of our strategy for American innovation calls on us as a nation to catalyze innovation on national priorities. If you recall a few days ago at the State of the Union, the President highlighted one of our national priorities, unleashing a clean energy revolution. This budget lays the framework for how we want to spur private sector action around a number of these key national priorities. And I'll highlight three in our discussion today. First, I'll speak a bit more about the work we're doing in energy. I'll highlight the work we're doing in healthcare, and I'll end with some broad themes that we're emerging around the role of data standards. First, on the area of energy. The President has, as Tom had described, put forward a series of research and development investments to sort of catalyze new ideas. The ARPA-E program that Tom had referenced has had a remarkable success in just its first several months of operation. 3,700 applications came in with game-changing ideas to look at our energy system, with only 37 funded slots to begin with. This budget builds on that, as Tom alluded to, with over $300 million in more resources to promote those investments. We're also looking at biofuels. The Department of Agriculture will receive about $170 million, focusing on those next-generation capabilities, many of whom would affect our rural communities and allow them to participate in this 21st century economy. We're also focusing on private sector investment tax credits. First, as a backdrop, the President has called for, as he had last year, for the permanent elimination of the research and experimentation tax credit. But to add more fuel to the clean energy focus area, we've called for an additional $5 billion in tax credits, but 30% on the investments for qualified investments for clean energy manufacturing projects in particular, so that we can take those great ideas and build those products and services of the future right here in the United States. We also acknowledge that we need to train our workforce in new and creative ways to be prepared for those national priority areas. We've put $85 million into workforce investments to promote green jobs. On the healthcare front, in addition to the $1 billion that Tom had referenced for research and development at the National Institutes of Health, we've also continued the program for healthcare information technology. Fiscal 2011 will be the first year the incentive payments that were initially made available through the Recovery Act will be deployed for doctors and hospitals all across the country. In addition to the resources that we're making available for incentive payments to doctors and hospitals, we will be continuing our work to build the foundational investments to allow for safe, secure sharing of information. You as a patient, for example, as we've called for, are entitled to an electronic copy of your medical record within 48 hours of visiting a hospital or a physician's office, so that you are in control of your own health care. Those resources will be put to play both in the current 2010, but will carry forward in fiscal 2011. But they speak to a third area where we see tremendous opportunity. We've added $70 million to the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, NIST, to look at ways in which data standards in the information technology space, more of an open nature, can help to spur new innovation and new opportunities in areas not just in healthcare, but in energy and in manufacturing. We have seen already the fruits of this effort. In December, we released our preliminary regulations on how we would reimburse physicians and hospitals for the adoption of healthcare information technology by describing a set of data standards that we think would be required so physicians and hospitals can share data with each other and with patients. This standards work, if done correctly, can spur innovation and invite entrepreneurs with great ideas to enter the market and to build those new ideas and services that we haven't even envisioned today. We're getting early feedback from that work in healthcare IT to suggest that they are in fact designed in a manner to spur entrepreneurship. We want to hear from you even further about the opportunities to see this reflecting in healthcare, energy, and in the new areas of manufacturing focused on green jobs. So I want to just share with you this framework of catalyzing innovation on national priorities as an important part of the overall strategy. And at this point, Cami, we'd love to welcome your thoughts, questions, and concerns.
Well, we have quite a few. We've gotten a lot of questions about education, and one that comes from Matt Froman from Facebook. Could you please go into more detail as to the investment into education and specifically what Peter Orszag outlined earlier this week?
Well, let me just frame it a little bit. And Tom, I would suggest you talk a little bit about STEM, because I think that's one of the areas that's most exciting. I mean, we have a number of very education-focused initiatives, starting with the education department's Race to the Top, which has quite a bit of success, and we're doubling down on ensuring that the state-level competitions that drive good innovations get spread throughout the country. We've set a very clear goal for the U.S. being the #1 in college graduations, and enormous amount of energy is focused on that for all universities, but especially community colleges. We've got a very strong focus on next generation scientists and engineers, which is at the core of the innovation pyramid. So maybe, Tom, you could touch on that a bit.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that the president did in November was to launch a very exciting initiative called Educate to Innovate, which is all about how do we get more young boys and girls interested in excelling in science, technology, engineering, and math education. And he issued a call to action because he believes that while there are some things that we can do here in Washington, we need to build a broad coalition that includes governors, the private sector, foundations, and grassroots volunteers. And I'm pleased to say that people have answered that call. In just the last couple of months, there have already been $500 million in investments that have been made to get more young boys and girls excited, to provide more opportunities for after-school science, to improve the number and quality of new math and science teachers. And there are also grassroots efforts. Let me mention just one. There's an effort called National Lab Day, which allows any teacher to post a hands-on project that they're excited about and to identify the help that they need. And scientists and engineers from all over the country and companies are going to this website, which is nationallabday.org, to find out how they can get involved and help.
If I may just add one other aspect of this, because it speaks to the notion of catalyzing breakthroughs in national priorities. The president in the budget announced that we will add $500 million to the Invest in Innovation Fund within the Department of Education. This groundbreaking program has essentially three core elements: allowing for seed capital to go to those really new and novel ideas to change the way we learn, improve the way we teach, and overall think about ways we can close the achievement gap. So early seed ideas are eligible for grant resources that are available through the Invest in Innovation Fund. Second, we believe a certain number of those ideas that are already in pockets in your neighborhood that we think have the ability to be replicated in other neighborhoods, they can apply for a demonstration grant that would allow them to take their idea and bring it to another community. And third, we see opportunity to scale the best and the most exciting and proven ideas that have been demonstrated successful so that we can maturely roll out those projects nationwide or within a given geographic region. So the Invest in Innovation Fund was been directly tasked with thinking about ways to change and modernize our approach to learning, and that has been the $500 million in the budget.
So we've actually gotten quite a few questions on STEM education specifically, and there's one suggestion from Greg Steele about connecting high school students with professionals in the fields of science and technology. What's being done, if anything, in the innovations budget, the President's innovations budget to do that?
Well, actually, the president in the speech he gave in January asked the 200,000 scientists and engineers that work for the federal government to get involved in these mentoring projects. And as I said, has also launched a National Lab Day, which is another way to connect high school students and middle school students to professionals in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
And specifically, if I may, on the budget side, I was with the Chief Technology Officer for Procter & Gamble, the innovative company in Cincinnati, Ohio, where they've adopted a half a dozen high schools where they actually bring their research and development teams out into the communities to collaborate and focus on basically science, technology, engineering, and mathematics training and mentorship. Those ideas are clearly appropriate for applying to that Invest in Innovation Fund that I just described. So it doesn't have a specific program that says go after mentorship, but I'm highly confident ideas like that will be those that will come forward in the Invest in Innovation Fund. Yes.
Vivek, did you want to add something?
Sure, and within the Federal CIO Council itself, one of the things that we're doing is we're making sure that CIOs across the federal government are actually mentoring high school students, and we actually have a day where we bring in high school students to shadow, and we're planning to expand that program even further to get more people in high schools and colleges excited about careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Great. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We have a couple of questions about small business. One coming from Jessica Peterson-Rogers, who would like one of you to elaborate a little bit more on what's being done to promote small businesses with the President's Innovations budget. And in addition, Anastasia Crossan wants to know how the R&E tax credit affects small businesses.
Oh, great questions.
Yeah, good questions. Let me start, and I think everyone can add a little bit. In this sort of middle part of the agenda, promoting competitive markets to spur entrepreneurial productive entrepreneurship, at the heart of that is really supporting small businesses. And throughout the course of the year, and certainly in the 2011 budget, there are a whole number of small business focused initiatives, whether they are the capital gains break for small businesses, whether it's the newly announced, as of just this week, plan to make more funds available to small business, whether it is different points of contact into the government and the resources of the government coming out of the State Department, the Commerce Department. We have a very clear focus on just how important small business is as an engine of growth, and you'll see that peppered throughout the budget.
Well, perhaps maybe a brief update, if I may. One of the areas for small businesses that we see tremendous opportunity is when an entrepreneur joins hands with the university to say, you as a faculty member have come up with a phenomenal idea. I would love to commercialize that idea into a product or service that I think can make a tremendous difference in our economy. We've put some resources in the budget. We have $12 million in experimental or seed capital funding to promote these innovation ecosystems where universities, as well as entrepreneurs and organizations that are working to matchmake, if you will, can find ways to close that gap between the great ideas that our university professors, graduate students, and undergraduate students have come up with, and marry them up to entrepreneurs who can take those ideas and build businesses, form the management team, and grow. We've seen so many examples this year of companies that have been born out of this ecosystem, and we have great promise and hope for promoting research and development commercialization. We have a number of programs that speak to this, but this example of the $12 million in the National Science Foundation is specifically and directly targeted at that focus. Just a personal aside, I visited the Consumer Electronics Show earlier this year, 100,000 people traveling all across the world to visit the Consumer Electronics Show. And as I toured the floor, Carnegie Mellon University had taken a booth right next to the Sony booth or the Microsoft booth. And they said, we've got great faculty ideas that are just yearning to turn into businesses. And they were there asking for partners to join them in commercializing the research that they had produced. This budget really speaks to how we can promote and finance and encourage more of that technology transfer.
And the other area is in how the federal government spends money in terms of procurement. So if you think about in the IT space alone, I talked about the $79 billion the federal government will be spending on information technology in fiscal year 2011. Part of what we've done already is we've launched initiatives like apps.gov. And part of the reason we did that is to attract some of the most creative companies that are out there to be able to come forward with the best ideas, the best thinking. Not everything in Washington has to cost millions of dollars, billions of dollars, or years to implement. So part of what we're trying to do is tap into that spirit of entrepreneurship to address some of the toughest problems we face in the federal government.
All right, I'm going to switch gears one more time, at least. We have a question that kind of hits upon clean energy and green jobs. Mark on Facebook writes, if we're going for innovation, why not a Manhattan Project level of effort toward clean and renewable energy? This effort would return to us a lead in R&D and put a lot of people back to work. Can you guys share your thoughts on that?
Well, in a sense, that, Mark, I mean, I really appreciate the question. That, in a sense, is how our framework is built. So the president acknowledges that to achieve the Manhattan Project for clean energy, that presumes that there's a certain degree of research and development investment, and that is what Tom Kalil had described as part of our building blocks of innovation. It presumes that we've created the market conditions to promote new product development, whether that be entrepreneurship or in the private sector and corporations, the development of new products and services. So making sure that we have the right market incentives and the market environment to catalyze. But to the point specifically on clean energy, we've acknowledged that as a national priority, we need to put those very, very targeted resources in ways that will leverage private sector investment. So what I hadn't mentioned, by the way, there's an additional $40 billion in loan guarantees that would allow the private sector to access this preferred source of capital to build the energy ecosystem. And we already have had a number of folks through the Stimulus Act take advantage of that program, and the president has continued the support for those loan guarantees in the energy space. We absolutely must lead in this domain, and was just with the president of MIT earlier today, who's built essentially a roundtable of private sector companies partnering with MIT to design and develop those energy technologies of the future. And there are American companies who are joining up on this global partnership so that we can take advantage of the brain power at universities like MIT and the University of Virginia and a number of other places around the country. That's precisely what this framework is meant to promote.
I think another way of picking up on what you're saying, Aneesh, is that what we need for a true clean energy revolution is multiple Manhattan projects, because this isn't one single thing that's going to get us what we want to do. And what you'll see throughout the budget, in addition to the things you mentioned, are important facilitations for aspects of this clean energy revolution. Take, for example, advanced batteries. A lot of money dedicated to both R&D in batteries, production in batteries, distribution of batteries. That's a whole other piece of this pie that's important. Energy efficiency is another part of the large clean energy revolution. And there, too, we've catalyzed all kinds of incentives and investments to try and effectuate that in addition to R&D or otherwise. So in some senses, it's a great analogy. It's a good question. In other senses, in this case, it's not a single objective, but multiple objectives that together will achieve that kind of revolution. And I think, in fact, you'll see that in the budget.
And kind of on this topic of like jobs of the future, clean energy jobs, green jobs, and kind of related to education, but not STEM education or high school and college. Gina Mortimer Store on Facebook asks, there are many middle-aged folks and seniors who could bring a lot to the table if they were given the proper education and training for these jobs of the future. Is there anything in the President's innovation budget that addresses that?
I could think of at least a couple things, and others should add. The President has put a very strong focus on community colleges, both in the budget and a lot of things he says. And part of that is because community colleges are accessible to people by and large, but also because they provide precisely a training ground for people at every stage of their careers. There are, in addition to that, a number of incentives for training or otherwise, but we think the existing community college infrastructure is a fantastic way to sustain that kind of training over the lifetime of a worker's life.
In the current bill that's pending before the United States Senate, focusing on the president's higher education goals, which had been referenced in the State of the Union, there had been a very explicit call for the development of an online skills lab so that we can build curriculum that can be delivered over the internet. A middle-aged or perhaps a senior citizen may not want to sit in a classroom setting and go a semester long to gather the knowledge necessary to retool for the 21st century economy. As we build out our capabilities online, we might learn at our own pace. We might be in a position to be more successful and to thrive on certain areas if the capacity and the technology allows us to integrate. So part of the answer on the budget is that we're going to have standards activities so that the educational content that's available today could be more easily mixed and mashed so that you can put together the right package of materials so that you can reconnect in the places where you see growth in your neighborhood. That is part of the president's education effort and aligned to the innovation strategy.
Great. So we have a question from Stephen Garrison on the issue of broadband. He asks, what can the government do to get broadband internet to all of those in the USA, specifically rural communities?
Well, we're doing a couple things. First of all, we're making a major investment in broadband with the Commerce Department and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Second, we're going to be working on making more spectrum available so that we have an explosive growth in mobile broadband services. And finally, later this year, the FCC is going to be releasing a national broadband plan, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Economic Council will be working with all the departments to find out what we can do, not only to accelerate the development of broadband, but applications that really improve our quality of life, whether it's making government more efficient or reducing the administrative costs associated with healthcare system, or developing online learning so that working adults can acquire new skills at a time, place, and pace that's convenient for them.
And in addition to broadband deployment, the president's budget actually has $35 million. And a big part of what we want to focus on is to make sure that we're building the applications in terms of mobile apps that the American people can access online. Part of what we want to be able to do is introduce innovations that we've seen in the consumer space to the public sector. So why not have an application that you can access, whether it's on your Facebook or your iPhone or your BlackBerry or any number of platforms in the mobile computing space to conduct business with the federal government, state government, local government, and we've actually partnered with NASIO and local governments to make sure that we build a set of applications that can be delivered on your mobile platform in terms of government services.
One just important note to think about on the issue of broadband. As more and more lives relate to the digital environment and we move more and more of our personal experiences into the online world, we acknowledge and in this budget have put resources against ensuring we've protected your privacy and that we've built strategies to address cybersecurity concerns. The president outlined back in May of 2009 that one of the key engines to drive economic growth, in addition to having the capacity of broadband available more widely, is to address the issues of cybersecurity, because we believe if we create more security into the network and we've built a more appropriate model for personal privacy, it will encourage more and more individuals to engage in electronic commerce, to engage with their physician in an electronic format, to capture the information from learning, school, or another program. So we're mindful of not just the supply side of this challenge, but also on how we create the market conditions to support it, and the budget reflects those needs in privacy and in cybersecurity.
And we're getting a lot of questions about the cost of higher education. Margaret Clements asks, or actually states, unfortunately, the cost of higher education in this country are borne by the student. This puts them at a disadvantage when compared to their international peers. And then Phyllis on Facebook also, she actually asks, what can the administration do to reinforce bright, productive citizens with student loan debt by offering some relief? Does anybody want to take that one?
One of the areas that I think has been very exciting of the last year, and reflected again in this budget, is the President's commitment precisely to keeping the cost of education low. As many of you have seen in the proposals that are sitting with the Hill right now, and in the budget, are an attempt to, in effect, disintermediate the very expensive private sector provision of student loans and make those loans, all that money saved, directly available to students for their own education. And it's a very significant contribution to ensuring access to funding for colleges. Many of you would have heard at the State of the Union address earlier the President talk about the university's responsibilities also to try and sustain costs and keep costs low. This is of prime most importance, and both in the funding and incentive systems given to the community colleges, in the funding and incentive systems given to students themselves, Pell Grants and otherwise, you'll see that this is a pretty high priority.
And if I may, just a brief word on this, just to set the stage. As the President set the ambitious goal that the United States will once again lead the world in the proportion of our population with college degrees by the year 2020, we have clearly articulated that one of the key ways to achieve that goal, as Deanna mentioned, is to expand our community college access. That's why that's been the primary focus of this. Community colleges, by and large, are extraordinarily cost effective. And we're starting to see new and more creative programs that link the community colleges to four-year schools and how price points can carry forward. So part of the innovation that we're going to see called for by the budget and the bills that are before the United States Congress speak to this very important issue. We do have budgetary activities to reduce the costs of borrowing and to address some of the issues using the tools of Pell Grants and others. But as the President said, we must improve productivity, and part of that is to think about creative ways to take advantage of our community college footprint, which has been a very, very cost-effective resource for the American people.
So we have time for just a couple more questions. We have one from Dennis Grote, who says, I support innovation initiatives to spur economic growth, but it seems that one step that may help is to provide tax incentives to businesses to develop those innovations here in the U.S. Mm-hmm. Does the President's innovation budget address that?
There are examples in both the Recovery Act enacted last year and in the budget of continuing tax production credits, R&D credits, and others, all of which enable the private sector to step in and actually provide some of that innovation. So in that space too, I think you will see both a continuation of programs that are in place and Recovery Act funds focused on that.
The President's committed to making the research and experimentation tax credit permanent. That's a tax credit that was created in 1981, and unfortunately it's been extended over 13 times and it's been allowed to lapse. And when companies are making an investment in R&D, they're making an investment in 3, 5, 10-year time frames. And if they don't know from 1 year to the next whether or not it's going to be extended, they can't count on it. So I think we could really increase its effectiveness by making it permanent.
I do want to point out that when I mentioned the $5 billion investment tax credit for clean energy manufacturing jobs, those were targeted at the United States domestic manufacturing capacity, just to be clear.
Great. And one last question. Will Deckery, I think I'm pronouncing that right, he asked what role the administration sees for nonprofits to play in the innovation space. For example, how does social entrepreneurship compare to tech, R&D, et cetera?
Well, first of all, let me begin by saying our colleague here, Sonal Shah at the White House, directs the White House Office of Social Innovation, and it has been a priority of the President's since the very beginning of the administration. We do have resources, at least $50 million in resources to promote social innovation fund that will help to build the capacity for more social entrepreneurs throughout the country. And I think this is part of a cultural shift in looking at how more and more of our principles in the private sector, when applied to nonprofit opportunities, really spur new and creative ways to tackling difficult problems. And this may traverse both social-oriented funds, social innovation activities, all the way through private sector firms who have a social conscious approach to some of their own activities. And I think the President has made very clear that this encouraging this set of activities has been a key priority. It's why we have a dedicated Office of Social Innovation to catalyze that activity.
We're also encouraging a number of public-private partnerships that involve not only companies, foundations, and social enterprises. So for example, associated with the President's Educate to Innovate initiative, he announced a collaboration that is occurring with the MacArthur Foundation, the Entertainment Software Association, Sony, and a number of the video game companies to see whether we can take what we've learned from the video game industry, which is that they have the ability to maintain the attentive time on task of young people for 5 hours a day, and see if we can use that for a broader set of national purposes other than teaching kids how to kill monsters and take their treasure.
Another really exciting part of this is I think the president recognizes that there has been a lot of innovation in the social sector and that there's a real opportunity to take that kind of innovation into the public sector. And there are ways of taking the Office of Social Innovation and matching up with the departments across the government to try and bring those experiences into the public sector itself, very much as you were describing before.
And one area where we actually already have seen tremendous results is actually on an initiative that the Obama administration launched, which was data.gov, where we were democratizing data on every aspect of government operations. And it was actually a nonprofit called Sunlight Foundation that within literally 24 hours of data.gov going live created an X Prize that challenged software developers across the country to build applications that would help the American people. And literally within a period of 1 week, there was a developer who created an application called flyontime.us that would allow anybody to go online and actually see average delay times of flights all over the country. And not only that, but people were tweeting on a real-time basis on what the delay times were at the airports, so that before you made a reservation online, you could make a more intelligent decision in terms of which flight you were going to book. And we've seen hundreds of applications that have been created as a result of the government literally just creating the platform, but nonprofits innovating and adding further value.
So democracy is not a spectator sport.
Absolutely not.
On that score, I was going to say, on that score, we are absolutely committed to continuous engagement and do encourage you to come to our website, www.whitehouse.gov, and find the Office of Public Engagement, where you can send messages, questions, or otherwise. Certainly join our innovation interest list. We'd love to keep you abreast of new developments and new talks, new papers we may issue and otherwise, because democracy is not a spectator sport. We want you to be part of this.
So I want to say, give a special thanks to all of our guests today, and of course to all of you out there that took part in today's live chat. And remember, go to whitehouse.gov to stay up to date on the latest for how you can stay engaged with your government.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.